Okay, so this it's a bit of a work in progress, so I'd really appreciate any kind of comments or suggestions that you might have when I finish. So yeah, so let me go ahead and get started. So this is the basic kind of structure of what I'm going to be talking about. I'll begin by discussing this principle of management, or this management system known as Taylorism. It's also sometimes referred to as scientific management. I will demonstrate how the principles of Taylorism are increasingly being used to administer the modern academy. And then I'll develop a critique of these principles, which is influenced by the German philosopher Martin Heidegger and his 1962 essay, The Question Concerning Technology. And then I'll conclude with some conclusions and some kind of implications of this analysis. So again, start off by talking about this principle Taylorism, otherwise known as scientific management. And I'll give you kind of a brief introduction to the core principles of scientific management. So this is the guy, Frederick Winslow Taylor. Those are his dates, and he's most famous for this book he published in 1911 called The Principles of Scientific Management. And so according to Taylor, the scientific management has 4 core principles. And so again, this is kind of quoting him directly. First, the development of a true science. Second, the scientific selection of the workman. Third, his scientific education and development. And then fourth, intimate friendly cooperation between the management and the men. And so I want to talk about each of these principles in turn, and then again, I'm going to apply them as I see it to the modern academy. So regarding these first 2 principles, the development of the true science, the scientific selection of the workmen, Taylor in his work demonstrates in detail how one can kind of apply science to the workplace and use science, as he understands it, to increase efficiency. And so he describes in great detail how one can undertake what he calls variously a time or a motion study, in which one examines each movement performed by a worker, times with a stopwatch how long each movement takes, eliminates extraneous movements, and then trains the worker to perform exactly and only those necessary movements. And then this is sort of used, this whole process is used to establish a baseline for how long it should take a worker to perform each task. This information is then used to determine which workers to hire, basically the workers who can do the sort of job as described, who can perform the task in the amount of time and in the way that the manager determines that it should actually be done. And so here's just, I thought this was kind of an interesting, I found this video. These are some very old time and motion studies, and you can kind of get a sense of sort of what's going on here. So again, this is some stuff about bricklayers, and so you can see, and I won't play the whole thing, but just a little snippet. So notice too, right, he's got this isn't Taylor, this is this other guy, but he's got this clock here so that he can time exactly how long it's taking that worker, that bricklayer, to perform each movement, right? And so you can kind of use this to figure out how to get a more efficient, this is like a time motion study, this is the exact idea behind it. So you can see right there timing, here's the bricklayer, and there's all these kind of extraneous movements as the bricklayer bends over, as he kind of walks over to the pile of bricks, etc., right? This is again a promotional video to kind of support this, all right? And so now here's the kind of the solution that's made. So you have these packets and other improvements to kind of eliminate what he's describing as waste motions, right? So you can see there now the bricks are kind of at the level of the worker as opposed to on the ground. The bricks are kind of right, as I say, brick grasping area maintained at wall level for accessibility. And then he's also kind of come up with this different, which we'll show in a second, this alternative method for a one motion grasp, right? So again, it's all about reducing the amount of motions, making it more efficient. So now, right, you can just grab the brick with one hand, and that is going to speed up the productivity of the bricklayer. So here you can see, again, this is a different person, but it's the same idea as what Taylor was getting at. And so you can see, right, he's going to compare the original method and the Gilbert method, right? 18 motions per brick for the original, 5 for the Gilbert. 175 bricks per hour in the original, 350 in the Gilbert, and so you have this 200% productivity increase. We'll get one more of these, which they'll get to in just a second, because I think it's very illustrative of exactly the kind of thinking and the kind of process that's going on here. So this is dating requisitions. And so you can see here's the one-handed motion. Again, he's got that stopwatch clock, so he can time exactly how long each motion takes, really down to kind of like the fraction of a second, right? So now here's our two-handed motion pattern. So you get this 21% increased input, and you'll see the person's working much faster. And then the next one, this is the 2 hands and 1 foot, right? And so this gives you a 30/50 per hour, so 61% more input. And so you can see, right, I think the foot is operating the stamp. And again, you can see, right, it's all timed. And then, just more and more examples of the same thing. But I think you get the sort of the basic idea of how this works. So in describing these kind of first two steps, Taylor distinguishes or contrasts his method of scientific management with what he describes as the then dominant older method, which he labels initiative and incentive. And so under this older model, the job of the manager, under the initiative and incentive model, the manager's job is really to keep an eye on things and to provide incentives to the workers to do the best job that they can, right? So that's really, again, this initiative and incentive. The idea is that the worker uses his or her own initiative, and the job of the manager is really merely to incentivize. So under this old model, the workers have a great deal of autonomy as long as they perform their assigned tasks in a timely manner. And the manager, again, doesn't need to do much beyond keeping an eye on things and developing the proper scheme of incentives to effectively motivate the workers. Similarly, under this older model, you don't really need very many managers. You have a lot more workers than you do managers. And the worker is really understood as the person who has the best understanding of the job, right? So the worker is really kind of the expert on his or her job. And so we can contrast this with what Taylor's arguing should be the case for scientific management. And so for one thing, the manager or the foreman is much more intimately involved with the employees and takes a much more active role in guiding and directing the work of the worker. So again, you can see, right, the manager determines the best way to do the job. And similarly, the manager sort of has the best understanding of the job. And you can see it's going to require a much more significant technological framework, infrastructure, and it's highly data-driven. So returning to these third and these fourth core principles, once the employer has determined how long a particular job should take and has hired the appropriate employees to do that work, the manager then has to spend an enormous amount of time and energy training the employee. And basically, it's kind of a one-on-one training for days or even weeks at a time. It also requires a significant increase in the number of managers in order to kind of oversee this work under the system of scientific management. So again, quoting Taylor, under functional scientific management, the old-fashioned single foreman is superseded by 8 different men, each one of whom has his own special duties. Taylor further goes on to note that, quote, there's an almost equal division of the work and the responsibility between the management and the workmen. And so as a result, the system is going to involve a significant decrease in the number of workers and a corresponding increase in the number of middle managers or foremen. As he noted above, right, it's an 8-fold increase in the number of managers. Furthermore, in the sort of examples that Taylor provides, you get an 8-fold increase in the number of managers and a 70 to 80% reduction in the size of the workforce, right? So again, a lot more managers, a lot fewer workers, unlike the initiative and incentive model, where it's mostly workers and then a few managers overseeing and incentivizing them. So there's 2 more elements to Taylor's theory I've sort of already mentioned. First, under this theory, the manager is seen as having a better understanding of the job than the actual worker. And in fact, Taylor actually takes it a step further, and he argues that because of the sort of technical details involved in scientific management, the actual worker is actually incapable of properly understanding his job to the extent that the manager does. So again, I'll quote from Taylor here, and this is also, I've got a bit of that quote right there. These illustrations should make perfectly clear our original proposition that in practically all of the mechanic arts, the science which underlies each workman's act is so great and amounts to so much that the workman who is best suited to actually doing the work is incapable, either through lack of education or through insufficient mental capacity, of understanding this science. Right? So again, you have this real shift from initiative incentive, where the worker has the best understanding of the job, to scientific management, where now the manager has the best understanding of the job. Another point, again, as the name scientific management suggests, this system requires an enormous amount of scientific machinery and know-how. In that book, The Principles of Scientific Management, Taylor goes on for pages about these kind of special slide rules and calculating devices that he and others have developed. And he also notes that the use of scientific management is going to require the construction of dedicated facilities for housing all of this data, as well as providing a fixed work area for the analysis of this data. Despite all these increased costs, of course, Taylor goes to great lengths to demonstrate the enormous increases in efficiency and productivity, that is profit, that his system provides, will nevertheless outweigh the additional kind of administrative costs associated with this new system, right? So you're going to significantly cut your workforce, but you're going to have to hire more middle managers. But he argues that kind of when you do the cost-benefit analysis, you make more money under the system of scientific management than you do under that older initiative and incentive model. And you saw, there's pretty significant productivity increases, right? The bricklayers were able to basically work twice as quickly under the method of scientific management. And then similarly with the stamping, there was a like a 61% increase in the efficiency, so they could get a lot more work done in a shorter amount of time. Okay, so now let me talk about how Taylorism, as I see it, is kind of infiltrating the modern academy. And when I'm talking about the modern academy, I'm thinking, here, Mesa College, and a lot of the examples that I'm going to give are drawn from Mesa College. But I think Mesa College is not special in this regard. This is just a kind of a natural sort of trend that we're seeing all over the place in higher education. And I want to just be clear, and this will kind of come up, especially when I start to discover Heidegger. I don't think Taylorism is being intentionally applied to higher education, right? I don't think managers, maybe they are, but I doubt that managers are reading the Principles of Scientific Management and thinking, wow, these are great ideas, let's apply them. Rather, what I intend to argue is that the kind of the mindset or the Weltanschauung worldview that higher education operates under shares many of the same values and assumptions as Taylorism, essentially to the point where I'm going to argue, and again, this is where Heidegger's going to come in, that they're basically operating under exactly the same worldview, whether or not that's explicitly realized. And in fact, that's part of the point of Heidegger's analysis, is that we often don't realize the worldview that we're operating under. But that's the kind of the way that I'm going to proceed. So starting with the first principle, again, going back to Taylor's first principle, which is the development of a true science, and then the second, which is the scientific selection. I think we can see how education, those of us who work in education, this is very obvious, is increasingly oriented around the development of what we could call a kind of science of teaching. And I think the best example of this is really the rise of learning outcomes, so-called student learning outcomes, and this movement in higher education. So this is actually from the Mesa College website. That's how they define student learning outcomes, right? They're developed, SLOs were developed to provide an ongoing process of information gathering and assessment that allows for meaningful student learning achievement and improvement to occur. Furthermore, SLO planning and assessment are also required for successful college accreditation purposes, right? So a lot of this is being driven by the need for accreditation, but frankly, I think a lot of the higher ups and administrators really like student learning outcomes, and I'll kind of talk about why that is in just a second. Because I think really what a CLO is at the end of the day is an attempt to kind of reduce the educational experience to something that can be analyzed and evaluated, ideally with the use of like an Excel spreadsheet or something, right? Furthermore, there's often these pushes to use a single standardized assessment tool for every section of a particular course, right? And one of the nice things I find about teaching philosophy, and one of the values of philosophy, is that you can have the same course and each philosophy professor is going to teach that course in a very different sort of way, may emphasize different sorts of things, but still give you kind of the basic or not the basic, but still give you the important elements of philosophy. But there's just, what's nice about philosophy, there's so many different ways to approach it, and kind of trying to squeeze everyone into this one-size-fits-all box, I think it does a real disservice to the way philosophy can be taught and to pedagogy generally. And I think I speak from experience as a philosophy professor, but I'm sure that those of you in other disciplines have a similar sort of attitude towards that. And again, the idea is, if you can use a single standardized assessment, this facilitates comparisons of faculty in a particular section, and you can determine which faculty are the most effective based on these numbers. And in my opinion, the end goal of all of this, despite I think what many would say, but it seems to me this is the end goal, is to use this data to evaluate faculty and inform hiring and discipline procedures. And I would refer you, this is the ACCJ standard 3.A.6. It's actually since been, since I started writing this paper, this has actually been rescinded by the ACCJC. They basically got sued by the City College of San Francisco and also the AFT union, and part of their settlement was the elimination of this. But you can kind of see the idea at work here. The evaluation of faculty, administrators, and other personnel directly responsible for student learning includes, as a component of that evaluation, consideration of how these employees use the results of the assessment of learning outcomes to improve teaching and learning, right? So you really see this idea of, as they say, evaluation directly tied to the use and the assessment of CLOs. This again has since changed a little bit, but I think basically the change has been individual faculty won't be evaluated, but programs and departments and the college as a whole is going to be evaluated based on its adherence to these CLOs. So that's a section of the paper actually I need to modify based on this new information. So turning to the third principle, which is the scientific education and development of the faculty member, I think we can see this trend most clearly at the large private for-profit schools such as the University of Phoenix, right? And I think this is kind of Taylorism in its most developed and extreme form when it comes to higher education. So I'll quote someone I've actually not taught at the University of Phoenix, but I've kind of heard reports, and so I'll just quote this one person talking about the experience. Academics are accustomed to and expect a degree of autonomy developing and teaching our courses. I think this autonomy goes against the University of Phoenix model of pre-developed courses and rigorous monitoring and evaluation of its professors. So basically, like when you teach a course at the University of Phoenix, you're given a shell, the assignments, in fact, the lectures, the material is all sort of already created for you, right? You don't even select your own textbook. They've got the textbook selected. They've got the course shell set up. They've got your syllabus, your schedule, all written out for you. And essentially, the professor's job is just to kind of deliver this pre-made material. There's very little kind of room for innovation or for the faculty member to implement their own lesson plan. And in effect, the professors just become these interchangeable units that can be swapped out as necessary. And anyone who meets the minimum qualifications for teaching can just be inserted into one of these courses with very little training or experience. And again, I think this is a very clear example of an attempt at kind of de-skilling or de-professionalizing the job of the educator. I think this is another area that I need to develop, but I think the kind of the latest push at the administrative level these days is something which is known as guided pathways. And the kind of idea behind these guided pathways is really about, again, it seems like streamlining and standardizing the majors, basically, so that students no longer really have any flexibility in the courses that they choose. They're just kind of assigned a program that tells them exactly which courses they're going to take. They take those courses, they get their degree, and then they're off to kind of the next school. And I think there's a lot that gets lost in this push to kind of completely standardize the education. And certainly here at Mesa, this push for guided pathways is very much a kind of a top-down sort of process, right? The administration is pushing it very heavily. And up to this point, there hasn't really been any input from the faculty because essentially, it's this idea, right? The managers know what's best, and so they're just going to impose this new principle on the faculty. So I think that's, again, you can sort of see similar examples of this. So turning to the fourth principle, and that concerns kind of this increase in managers, I think there's been, as we can see, there's very clearly been an enormous rise in the number of administrators and support staff in higher education. So just a couple of quotations here. The first, every year, hosts of administrators and staffers are added to the college and university payrolls, even as schools claim to be battling budget crises that are forcing them to reduce the size of their full-time faculties. As a result, universities are filled with armies of functionaries, the vice presidents, provosts, associate provosts, vice provosts, assistant provosts, deans, deanlets, deanlings, and each commanding staffers and assistants, who more and more direct the operations of every school. And increasingly, it's very common for these administrators to really have no experience whatsoever in actually being in the classroom. At least here in our school, I personally think we're very fortunate that our dean is a former professor of history. So, I give a lot of props to Dean Zappia for actually having been in the classroom and taught extensively and understanding the needs of faculty. But increasingly, a lot of the administrators, certainly above him, don't really have that kind of experience. And a lot of deans in a lot of different schools have really never been in the classroom at all. He's the one dean who has. Yeah. I thought Tina Ricaldi used to be a professor. Okay, so she was an assistant professor and then moved up to her dean position. Although that's something, right? At least it's, yeah, it was in the classroom for a little bit, but I think increasingly you don't really see that a whole lot from administrators. This quotation here, it comes from the Delta Cost Project. It's a nonprofit organization that tracks education funding and education spending. And so in 2014, they issued a report that documented the rise in the number of administrators and administrative support staff at US colleges and universities. And so according to that data, there are now in many cases more administrators and support staff than there are full-time faculty. So again, quoting from them, back in 1990, all types of public and private colleges and universities averaged more full-time faculty positions than administrative positions. So again, public non-research institutions in 1990, that's us, right? We're a public non-research institution. In 1990, averaged roughly twice as many full-time faculties as administrators. More than 20 years later, the two were almost equal. So we've seen a significant reduction in the number of full-time faculties and a corresponding increase in the number of administrators. And a lot of that decrease in full-time faculty that's being made up by adjuncts, right? Who are kind of, again, the sort of migrant labor of the modern university. There has been this kind of significant, right, decrease in state funding, in public funding, and so that has to be made up somewhere. But I do think it's interesting that, the one place where you don't ever see cuts is in the number of administrators or in kind of administrator salaries, right? It's always sort of the faculty who are expected to do more. The departments are expected to do more work with less full-time faculty, and increasingly adjuncts are brought in, and really adjuncts are just there. They show up, they teach a class, and then they're on their way. And for a variety of reasons, I think it's because they're not getting paid, it's not really appropriate to ask them to do a lot of the kind of administrative work that's expected of a full-time faculty member. But so again, we have this system, right, where there's just been this dramatic increase in the number of administrators, reduction in the number of full-time faculty. And as a result, the college, I think, is increasingly run in accordance with the values that these administrators care about. And so in general, the administrators are increasingly focused on data and emphasize hitting certain target numbers. And again, the teaching profession is basically getting reduced to a series of data points, and the performance of departments and programs is evaluated, frankly, on the basis of whether or not certain data targets are met. Again, this is, I think, very clear in the student learning outcome movement, where, again, a significant amount of resources at the college are dedicated to collecting and tracking this data. And frankly, I find it absurd. I'm one of the people in my department responsible for collecting and tracking this data. And the amount of time that I spend on just manual data entry is sort of absurd, I mean, I have a PhD and you're paying me to just kind of put numbers into a spreadsheet. I mean, it just seems like a real waste of what I can provide and what I've been trained to do. But again, got to have those numbers. The administrator's got to be able to see those numbers. Otherwise, they're going to come down very hard, maybe reduce funding for different programs. I think a very clear example of what I'm talking about comes from a recent article in Inside Higher Ed, which was about a decision by Mills College in Oakland. It's a private school in Oakland, to lay off several tenured faculty and eliminate a number of departments, including the philosophy department. So obviously this is near and dear to my heart. So the provost and the dean of faculty, Julia, I'm not sure how to pronounce her name, Opara, had the sort of following statement about the rationale behind this decision. As you can see, she writes, "But the school also has to consider which majors and minors students select. Philosophy is not a top choice. The college currently has just 3 philosophy majors," right? And so that, that failure to hit, kind of enrollment targets or whatever is then used as a justification for eliminating the philosophy department. And again, I think this is a mindset that's very closely aligned with the scientific management mindset, where there's really no consideration for other, maybe less calculable or tangible values. And I think you can really see that in this quotation from a philosophy professor, this guy Mark Joseph, who asks, how does one have a liberal arts program without a philosophy program, right? So here you have a person who's just evaluating things solely in terms of the numbers, and here's someone trying to evaluate the performance of the college in terms of what it offers, in terms of the kind of the education that it provides and the educational environment that it provides. So I think you can kind of see these sort of 2 very different mindsets at work here. So as I put it, the dean is only concerned with hitting certain target numbers, and if those numbers aren't met, programs and faculty are eliminated. By contrast, the professor is concerned with the quality of education that's being provided at the institution. Okay, so at this point, I think the question is, well, so what, right? If the academy has adopted many of these principles of scientific management, who cares? If it produces a more efficient academy, better learning experience for students while reducing costs, well, then who can complain about that, right? It's cheaper, it's faster, more effective. And so what follows, I want to try and use a Heideggerian analysis to criticize this approach. And so I'm going to jump into and try and give you a very brief summary of this essay, Heidegger's Question Concerning Technology. So there's Martin Heidegger, he's German, lived from 1889 to 1976, and he published, there's lots of different versions of this essay, but the kind of main version came out in 1961 and then was translated into English in 1977. So the core of Heidegger's analysis is the claim that the essence of technology is not to be found in any particular technological device, but rather that the essence of technology amounts to a certain worldview or way in which the world is kind of conceptualized or disclosed to us. And so much of Heidegger's kind of later thought, and this essay comes from his kind of later period, is an examination of the different ways in which the world appears or shows up to us. And I'm quoting a very important commentator of Heidegger, this guy, Hubert Dreyfus. He writes, Heidegger came to argue that the philosophical history of the West consists of a series of epochs of different total understandings of being, and that the concealment of being varies according to the background understanding of being. It's a little difficult to talk about Heidegger without resorting to this kind of Heideggerian jargon. But basically, Heidegger's analysis is focused on these different ways that the world appears to us or shows up to us. And these different kind of Weltanschauungen amount to different frameworks through which individuals understand and interpret the world they find themselves in. And furthermore, these different frameworks also play a role in shaping the nature of truth and provide standards for what counts as true or false and what counts as sort of good and bad or valuable and not valuable within that given Weltanschauungen. So turning kind of the present age, Heidegger identifies our current worldview as the technological worldview of what he calls enframing, das Gestell in German, but enframing is usually how it's referred to. And the defining feature of this technological worldview, the worldview of enframing, is that everything in the world is conceptualized as a resource. The term that Heidegger uses is der Bestand, which is often translated as standing reserve, but frankly, I think the word resource is a much better translation, a much better term for what he's getting at. And so everything is understood as a resource that is to be used and exploited by humanity solely for humanity's own benefit. And he really illustrates this point by looking at the Rhine River, which is one of the major rivers that runs through Germany. And he contrasts, Heidegger's very, very into German lyric poet, particularly this poet Hölderlin. And so he kind of contrasts what he sees as sort of the modern way of looking at the world with the way that the river is viewed in this very famous poem by Hölderlin on the Rhine. And so he writes, what the river is now, right, under enframing, is a water power supplier, right? You can see here, the Rhine has been heavily dammed, and these dams are part of this large kind of hydroelectric facility. What the river is now, namely a water power supplier, derives from out of the essence of the power station. That is, the river gets its meaning, and the river is understood based on its relation to the power station and as a source of power for that power station. Now, one might object to this and say, well, no, we still take an effort to preserve nature in the form of parks, national monuments, and things like that. But Heidegger argues that even that attitude is still governed by the worldview of enframing. As he says, but it will be replied, the Rhine is still a river and a landscape, is it not? Perhaps, but how? In no other way than as an object on call for a tour group ordered there by the vacation industry. And so even as a kind of a landscape, the Rhine is conceptualized within this framework of enframing, where everything is understood as a resource to be used and to be exploited, in this case as a recreation destination or setting for tour groups. And I'll just say, I was doing Google image searches for pictures of the Rhine, and the very first images that showed up were all promotional images of Rhine river cruises. Right? So again, you can see that kind of mindset is very much at work. Here, you can see the Rhine. It's kind of conceptualized as this force, right? The humans are just dwarfed by these falls, by the cataracts. Even their buildings, are completely dwarfed by the kind of the power and the majesty of the river. And that's a very different way of conceptualizing the river from, let's dam it and use it to run turbines. When you think about the natural world, right, it's always, just to think about our current administration, right, there's this real push, these natural parks, this is interfering with our ability, to extract resources, to extract wealth, to extract money from the natural parks. So even then there's this push to reduce the size of the national parks, open up drilling in the national parks, because again, everything has to be understood as something that's there for us to use. Unlike, I think, this sort of more older view, the sort of the Hölderlin view, where in some sense the river is a kind of a force around which human life is kind of organized and has to deal with. So I think it's a very different, and that's what Heidegger's getting at, it's a very different way of conceptualizing and understanding what the river is and how one is related to that river. I think really the best example of what I'm talking about, which Heidegger didn't mention, but I think it's the clearest example, is you look at the department at a corporation or college that's responsible for hiring people and managing employee benefits, right? And this, of course, is the Department of Human Resources. And so it's right there in the name, right, that human beings are being conceptualized as resources, right? In the same way that the Rhine River is a resource for powering the dam, humans are conceptualized as a kind of a resource for powering the company. And one of the characteristics of a resource is it's kind of there to be used, and in some sense, there to be used up. And then once it's used up, it's discarded, and you get more resources, right? And you seek more. So, and again, I don't want to say that the people who work in these departments aren't professionals, they don't have the best intentions. I'm sure they don't think of employees in that way, but it's just this whole kind of global mindset which shapes how we understand what it is to be an employee, how we understand how the employees, right, relate to the employer. And that's, again, getting at these ideas of Taylorism and scientific management. So that's the kind of the worldview of enframing that Heidegger's getting at. And so what's the criticism? What's the problem with this worldview? Well, for Heidegger, the biggest problem with this technological worldview of enframing is that it covers up or it hides its nature as just one way in which to view or understand reality. As Heidegger puts it, it covers up or hides its nature as a mode of disclosing and covers up what it fundamentally means to be a human, which is to create structures of meaning and intelligibility in the world. So as Heidegger puts it, where enframing holds sway, regulating and securing of the standing reserve mark all revealing, they no longer even let their own fundamental characteristic appear, namely this revealing as such. So in effect, enframing is an inauthentic worldview because it covers up or conceals the very fact of its own existence. And so a lot of what Heidegger sort of argues in favor of is understanding this role that we play in shaping and conceptualizing the world. But the problem is that people, in some sense, don't even realize that there's other ways to think of the Rhine River than as a natural resource that is exploited to power a power station, or as a tourist destination which can generate revenue for the economy. So when caught in this worldview of enframing, humans don't even realize that they're caught in it, and they just take the assumptions and the values inherent in enframing for granted as just features of the way the world is and always has been. So they become trapped in this worldview, don't even realize that alternative and perhaps more authentic ways of conceptualizing and understanding the world are available. So let's talk then about, tying all this stuff together, right? So we've been talking about Taylorism, talking about Heidegger, talking about Taylorism in the modern academy. So let's put everything together. And so I want to look at this kind of initiative and incentive model, contrast it with the scientific management model, and sort of think of that in terms of enframing and these other kinds of ways of conceptualizing our relationship to the world. And I think one really interesting way to look at this, I just kind of came across this work, and I just was really fascinated by the approach that it took, but to step back a little bit from our role as faculty and look at how these trends are playing out amongst the custodial staff, right? And I think this is valuable for a couple of reasons. First, I just think it's a really good illustration of what I'm trying to argue, what I'm trying to talk about. And I think it's also good for us to, maybe take a little time to think about these often invisible people who sort of show up late at night after everyone else has left the campus. And they do a lot of really important work that allows us to function, right? It allows us to just focus on teaching. It allows the students to just focus on learning, because the custodial staff is doing all this kind of work in the background. So what I'm focusing on here is this research that was conducted by this guy, Peter Magolda, at two Midwestern colleges. He calls them Harrison and Compton University, but those are pseudonyms or basically to maintain kind of confidentiality. Magolda is, I think, a sociologist, so he's looking at custodial workers. And so what he does in his book is he contrasts these two perspectives on custodial work. And one is the customer service management ideology, which is kind of the approach taken by the custodians, and contrasts that with what he calls this corporate managerialism ideology, which is the ideology that is corporate managerialism. It's the ideology that is held by the managers. And I think these two ideologies match up very nicely. Customer service matches up very nicely with that initiative and incentive model, and corporate managerialism matches up, I think, very nicely with that kind of model of scientific management. So the customer service initiative and incentive models are the ones that privilege and prioritize the actual insights and perspectives of the workers actually performing these jobs, right? So again, under the customer service ideology, the focus of custodians is on serving the interests of the customers, and the highest value that they use is customer satisfaction. Magolda notes that, from the perspective of teaching, this customer service ideology is maybe not really appropriate for teaching, but it is, certainly the way that custodians often like to think or conceptualize their work. And again, the idea is, the custodial workers have the autonomy to decide how best to satisfy the needs of the customers and the groups that they're servicing, right? By contrast, under corporate managerialism, the focus is on fiscal stability, and the highest priorities are fiscal stability, minimizing labor costs, and increasing the accountability of the custodial workers. And you'll notice, right, there's no, right, at least the custodians are sort of thinking about, well, the people that we're doing this work for. The managers are just thinking about, these kind of numbers, these targets. And again, under this model, you have, this idea that the administrators or the managers, they're the ones who know best how the work has to be done, and it's somewhat the job of the custodian to conform to those management dictates. under this model, then supervisors, not workers, know what counts as good. And so here's just an example. It's a little hard to see, but this is the essentially the rubric that is used to evaluate custodians. And you can see, right, they got 60 points for public areas, 30 points for student suites, and then 10 points for the housekeeping closet. And basically the manager, goes, observes, fills out this rubric, and then the custodian is expected to score an 85 or higher on the rubric, right? And if they fall below that number, then there's a problem, they can be disciplined, et cetera. But again, the idea is, the manager is basically saying, here's what's important in your job, right? I don't care what you think is important about your job. I don't really care what the customers, the people you're servicing, think is important. These are the things that are important, right? And and you have to do these things, and anything else doesn't matter. All that matters is really summarized right here on the rubric, right? So it's a very kind of constraining, and one of the things that Magolda talks about is he gives a lot of interviews with custodians who talk about how they feel sort of oppressed by this rubric, and they feel like it interferes with their abilities to do the best job that they can for their customers. It interferes with their ability to kind of prioritize certain things that need to be done. And again, it kind of takes away a lot of the autonomy that the custodians previously had. And so again, I think this serves as a really good example of inframing or scientific management, in that it seeks to reduce everything the custodial workers do to a framework that is quantifiable and calculable, right? And so the very humanity of the custodial worker is lost, as they're basically, everything they do is just reduced to a numerical score on a rubric, right? And you can imagine, you can track that, right? You do all these rubrics, you put them into a spreadsheet. Oh, this custodial worker is getting an average of 93, this custodial worker is, kind of trending downwards, and you can imagine kind of hiring and firing decisions just made solely on the virtue of these numbers in a spreadsheet, right? Which is what this approach really allows one to do. I think we also see this right in the case of the what I previously described about Mills College, where it was the same thing, right? The success of the department was based on these numbers, right? Number of majors, et cetera. And everything and all decisions, are made about the staffing based on just those numbers. So second issue here concerns the enormous role that data plays in the modern academy. College administrators, they put an enormous confidence in data, and they devote a great deal of time and energy to collecting as much data as possible, and we have a lot of mandates for data collection as well. These are, for example, the data that we collected for our critical thinking CLO in the Department of Social Sciences, and you can see, right, everything, is in this nice chart. And so, for example, Mesa, has an Office of Institutional Research whose mission is, quote, to build a culture of inquiry and foster data-informed decision-making by providing research services, expertise, and coaching to the Mesa campus community in support of the college's institutional effectiveness, right? So basically this office, they just generate a bunch of reports, and these reports, these data-driven reports, are what are informing the decisions made by administrators, right? And so our campus knows how successful it is by looking at persistence, completion, transfer numbers, things like that. And basically everything is reduced to a number in a spreadsheet or a number on a dashboard. And so I would argue that this reliance on data is really an outgrowth of this inframing mindset that's come to dominate the modern academy. Data is seen as important because the academy has adopted a certain worldview that sees data as important. There are other worldviews, other ways of conceptualizing the role of a college that don't have that same demand or vision. And in many cases, I think this data isn't collected because it's actually useful. The data is collected because it can be, right? Data collection is, of course, always based on measures that are easy to calculate, easy to quantify in a spreadsheet. And then ways are found to use that data, even if those uses go against what I would argue would be the core mission of the academy. And so again, the example of Mills College, I think, is a really good illustration of that point. Okay, so let me just wrap this up. That's good, actually, just right on time. And so a couple of major kind of conclusions here. The first is more of a conclusion, the second is a solution. So I think one conclusion, and this is just kind of, as Professor Rosenstand mentioned, I have a real interest in labor history. And I think a lot of what this analysis shows is that professors, faculty members, we're subject to exactly the same forces that are affecting people who are working in factories, people who are working in manufacturing, so-called blue-collar workers, right? So, I think education work is labor work. And when labor is suffering or negatively impacted, education suffers and is negatively impacted as well. And I think that's what this analysis shows, is there is this very close connection between the two. And again, I would hope that this perspective can help foster a greater solidarity among all segments of the workforce, and that white-collar professors can realize that we are impacted and subjected to the same negative forces that are impacting blue-collar, custodians and other laborers. I like to always sort of quote the old International Workers of the World slogan, an injury to one is an injury to all. And again, I think we can see that at work in this mindset. The second point is that to the extent that Heidegger provides a solution or a way out of this problem of enframing, if in fact I'm correct in my analysis, then the solutions that Heidegger suggests may also be solutions that will work in some sense to save the modern academy. So according to Heidegger, while enframing is, as he puts it, a kind of a totalizing and inauthentic worldview, it also contains within it the seeds of its own overcoming, the seeds of its own destruction. So quoting Hölderlin again, Heidegger writes, "Where the danger is, there the saving power grows also." And again, while he's more cryptic, I think, about the meaning of this than we might like, I take him to be arguing that the very crisis created by enframing may in fact push humanity to overcome it and adopt a more authentic worldview, much in the way that I think perhaps Republican attacks on healthcare may actually ultimately create a more welcoming political environment for the establishment of single-payer care in the United States, right? So in some sense, this, pushing these worldviews, pushing these frameworks too far produces a kind of a counter to those frameworks. So what might that solution be? What might it look like? And the answer I'll provide comes from the work of Hubert Dreyfus, who is a professor of philosophy at the University of California, Berkeley, and basically was the individual who taught me Heidegger and also actually inspired me to make philosophy my profession. And so he talked a lot about what he called a free relation to technology. And so as he sees it, the solution to enframing is not to become a kind of a Luddite and abandon or eliminate all technology, but rather to employ technology where it's useful, while at the same time acknowledging that one of the fundamental characteristics of our human nature is the role that we play in creating meaning in the world. And so we need to realize that enframing is not a necessary feature of human existence, but actually a choice or a decision that we have made about how to see the world. There's nothing inevitable or necessary about this worldview, and we are free to adopt other worldviews that are more authentic and that can serve us more effectively, right? So we don't just have to take this stuff for granted. We can articulate, counter narratives and counter understandings of how the modern academy should be conceptualized. And then I'll conclude. Part of the inspiration for this paper was the passing of Dreyfus in the summer of 2017, and so I will dedicate this to him, and I hope it sort of to some degree lives up to the standards of Heidegger scholarship that he upheld in his own life and in his own work. He's a great professor. Okay, so that kind of wraps things up on my end.
First of all, you did a great job. And I was just talking about Taylorism in class yesterday. So I want to start with a couple of observations and then maybe a more academic one. One, just parenthetically, my daughter graduated from Mesa like 2 years ago.
Oh.
And so it's just amazing that this happened there.
Yeah.
And how ignorant that dean is of the role of philosophy in the development of science. And just the idea that just because people aren't majoring in philosophy, that means necessarily that a course of philosophy is not contributing to their education or understanding of the world.
Yeah.
Secondly, my cousin did an MBA in school of business and learned that Taylor was a hero because he made work more productive. At the same time he was learning that, I was taking a course called Labor History and Economics, we read a book by Harry Properman called Labor Monopoly Capital, where he argued that Taylorism was awful because it took the work process out of the hands of the worker and increased bureaucratic alienation.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's interesting congruences there too. I don't lie about an education and processes of the world. Now, one of the things I would suggest adding to this is that, especially in the comparison of the two ways of thinking about custodial work, and what's missing is the ideological work involved in changing what constitutes customer satisfaction. And so, looking at it in terms of the academy, students are encouraged to see education as job training and take its success or failure as measured by how well it gets them a good paying job, instead of seeing education as an end in and of itself, or the preparation of better citizens, or all the other ways that people thought about education historically. So the two models aren't as separate as perhaps some of those charts might indicate.
Yeah. Yeah, at the ACCJC presentation on Monday, the president of the ACCJC, Richard Wynn, talked a lot about the importance of CLO data is there to show return on investment, right? So the public is putting money into the college, and they expect something measurable and calculable out of that.
And one of the things we're trying to do is measure things that cannot be quantified, like critical thinking.
Yeah.
And so they come up with these measures that mean nothing.
Right.
And so the whole definition of what is data, what is scientific data, they don't even address. And
because they're not thinking critically.
Yeah.
well, yeah.
And I think in some sense, data is just what can be collected and put into a spreadsheet, right?
For them.
For them, yeah.
Yeah, if it's a number, it's data.
Yeah.
And it's really maddening to have to compile data that is not actually data in the sense of scientifically collected information. It's
Right.
just arbitrary numbers.
Yeah. Yeah. John?
Any students with questions first before I? Got a couple points I'd make. One of them is that the effort for management to gain control over production, take it away from craft workers, is definitely ideological. It's partly to be able to hire workers that are replaceable, and skilled craft workers are not replaceable. We're talking here principally about a time before there's heavy mechanization. So a lot of the work was done with hand tools. And so management wanted to figure out how to take that kind of control of the work process out of the hands of skilled workers so that they could break down the very small parts and then have easily replaceable unskilled laborers do each one little piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
It's tied to the assembly line and to piecework. There's also another motivation, and that is the attempt to break unions. As the craft workers had often organized skilled craft guilds. And by breaking it down, breaking work down into parts that could be performed by laborers, not craft workers, by laborers, with management really knowing how all the parts fit together under this new regime, unions were easily dispatched.
Yeah.
Because the laborers could easily be replaced.
Right. Yeah. Craft workers can withhold their labor and they're not replaceable in a way.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
so you might want to highlight a little bit more about unionism in this presentation, because I don't think I heard the word union.
Yeah. No, it didn't come up, but that's good.
And are you aware of the scholarship of David Montgomery?
No.
Okay, well, you absolutely need to, he's dead now, but he was the first labor historian ever hired at Yale.
Oh.
And he wrote a book called Workers' Control in America in 1979.
What was the title again?
Workers' Control in America. And he was himself a steelworker originally. And then he went on and earned a doctorate, was the first labor historian ever hired at Yale. So here he was, a communist steel worker who becomes a professor at Yale. And he studied this whole process, and you'll find it very interesting.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
I might also, just one other point I might make, Jim Grossman, who is the executive director of the American Historical Association, published an article that appeared in the AHA Perspectives, which is a magazine for people in the profession. And he's kind of speculating ahead. What would happen in a graduate program in about 2030 or so? Given changes in technology, given changes in the academy and all the rest. And, you know, for the Mesa College students that are here, there are far, far more PhDs in history than there are jobs for PhDs in history, especially the tenure line jobs like I have. I've been here for 28 years.
Same in philosophy.
There are many instructors that teach, you know, a few courses here, a few courses here, a few courses there. They get paid much less. They often don't have benefits. They're completely dispensable. They are the laborers, if you will. Smart laborers, but they're laborers, if you will.
Yeah, the migrant workers.
They're the migrant workers. And, you know, that's a huge crisis in the history profession. And Jim Grossman's speculating that maybe at some point in this world he's envisioning, adjuncts will have decided that they're no longer going to be adjuncts anymore. They're not going to be exploited. And the history profession is going to start developing new ways of thinking about how people would advance degrees in history will be able to enter into the world and play a productive role in the world without being exploited in the same way. So one of the visions he has is that people will study, they will earn advanced degrees in history, and they will become administrators. Now, they may be other things too. They may go into museum work, they may go into government agencies and become historians of government agencies and provide that kind of rich knowledge about how the organizations have functioned. But really interestingly, he says some of them will become administrators right out of earning a degree. And to me, that's a little troublesome. He's seeing it as a possible channel for taking some, you know, for relieving a problem.
Yeah.
But as you said before, there's only one dean on this campus right now who has an advanced degree and a lot of teaching experience before becoming a dean.
Yeah. I mean, most of them have these, you know, an EDD and a doctorate of education, and they're literally going from, you know, doctorate of education to an administrative position at a college.
Doctorate of education is really about management,
Yeah.
not about academics.
Yeah.
And so I would just say that it's really unclear which way we'll be heading in the future with regard to that point you made.
Yeah.
And I'll close up for now.
Yeah. Please. What's your name?
Alex.
Alex.
Yeah. The time-lapse sequence of the work efficiency was really intriguing to me. It reminded me of a film you may have seen, Manufactured Landscapes. I highly recommend it. It's got a relationship with that. One of the sequences is manufacturing an object, or it's a light switch, I think, some kind of electronic device that was designed in Holland and then manufactured, or actually assembled, not manufactured, but assembled in China. So all the componentry was actually coming from Holland as well. And then they just kept showing this woman repeatedly assembling this. She could do it blindfolded. You could see how efficient she was. But they keep repeating it to the point where it becomes a habituation. And it reminded me of what you were kind of representing there. And the point being is that I'm interested in knowing if in Taylor's work, if he in fact looked at evaluating the physical conditions of the work versus just the efficiencies of this and skill of the laborer,
Right.
and the involvement of the administrator.
So he does look a lot at the the physical environment of the worker, but it's always towards that goal of increasing productivity, right? And so to the extent that manipulating the environment increases productivity, he's interested in the kind of the environment of the worker, but it's always towards that end goal of maximizing productivity. I mean, you see that a little bit, right, when they're talking about the bricks, changing the workspace of the worker to increase efficiency. I think this comes up a lot too in manufacturing where, and I'm not sure exactly the details, but I think, for example, eliminating windows, right, so that the worker can't get distracted by what's going on outside, right? You eliminate windows. It's not unlike what they do in casinos, but you eliminate windows, you control the lighting, and then in some sense you've kind of taken control of the workday of the employer, so they don't have any cue about, oh, it's getting dark, it's time to leave. It's this constant, stable, unchanging environment. And again, to the extent that that increases productivity. And sometimes, sometimes this stuff is about, one way to increase productivity is you make sure that the worker gets a 15-minute break every hour or every 2 hours, right? But again, it's always shaped by that mindset of maximizing productivity, getting the most possible out of the worker, and all changes, all modifications are justified by that end goal. Which again, I take it as sort of this framing mindset. Maybe I misunderstood here.
No, that was great clarity. What I would say is that would probably be a great addition to the discussion, is kind of that evaluation of the worker's environment.
Yeah, that's good.
Aside from just kind of biasing it towards the efficiencies of their skill, as well as the administrator's involvement. It's interesting to kind of reflect on what my wife does for work. So she works in biotech, and she manages clinical oncology studies. And it's interesting because she comes from a different environment prior to her current environment, and she brought her skill with her to that new environment, and that environment outright rejects all of the skill that she's amassed and that can bring to the table.
Right. And
so it kind of implies that hegemony of the administrator and the role that she plays in relationship to them. It's more of a do, don't think kind of scenario.
Yeah, and that's very much the impulse behind scientific management, right? And again, that's that idea, right, that the manager knows how to do the job, the worker doesn't, right? And if the worker has a different view than the manager, the worker's wrong. Unlike the older initiative and incentive model where the worker's ingenuity, skill is valued by the employer, it's valued by the manager. Yeah, that's a great example. Yeah.
I would also add that Taylor was writing in the late 19th century, early 20th century, a time when there was an enormous surge of immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. He had...
And the boom of the Industrial Revolution
yes,
as well.
But I'm thinking particularly here about the ethnicity of the workers. So he had very condescending notions of the workers, and he writes about workers using ethnic stereotypes to describe them. He cares nothing about the integrity of the workers. He only cares about efficiency.
Were there discussions of communications or lack of,
yes,
like the inability to speak the language?
They were essentially ignorant people, and you had to manipulate them in order to get them to do the simple tasks. Mm-hmm. And the way you manipulate them is by manipulating the wage system. So that's where this piece rate comes in. You provide them certain incentives to working faster by keeping the wages so low that in order to make enough to live, they have to work twice as hard as they would if they didn't have that kind of compulsion. And then if they start to make more money because they're working more efficiently, then the piece rate system can be adjusted so that at the end, the management isn't paying out any more than they were when the workers weren't working quite so fast. In other words, there's no more money put out because you're just manipulating, the surge to produce at the maximum level.
Yeah, Just to refer to this quote, I mean, this line about, the worker has insufficient mental capacity, and I think you're exactly right. It's not so obvious here, but there's clearly a kind of racial element at work there. Because actually where this quote comes from, he's describing this situation, and he goes to great pains to he's talking about this conversation he's having with this worker, and he goes to great pains to reproduce the kind of poor, broken English that the worker is using.
He calls them dumb Polacks,
Yeah.
and things like that from the Polish
Yeah.
language.
Yeah.
Not Polacks, but
Polacks, that was one.
I don't see what the solution is.
Yeah. No, it's unfortunate. It is vague. Yeah.
Have you philosophized and constructed your own ideal world and care to share?
Yeah. Well, so I mean, I go back to this idea, and again, you're right. I mean, it's very vague. This notion of a kind of a free relation to technology. But I guess the idea there is that, because sometimes you might read, Heidegger and think, oh, well, the solution is, we just go back, get rid of all the technology, the kind of Luddite solution, smash our cell phones and things like that. And that's not going to happen. And arguably it shouldn't. I mean, the cell phone, it's an incredible device. It's a little sad when you go out to dinner and everyone is just kind of staring at a screen.
Or you walk into a classroom, the students are silent, and they're all texting. When we used to walk into a classroom, the students were having discussions.
Yeah. And so it's sort of it would be, and so I think the idea is, and again, it's very hard to do because, and this is one of the problems with technology, because it is so enveloping in the way that it becomes invisible almost, and people don't even think about what's involved. But I think, we do need to start rethinking our relationship to technology, and you kind of start to hear rumblings of this from various sectors about people especially concerned with how much time people are spending on Facebook and how Facebook is being used to potentially by our enemies to influence the outcome of our political elections and to shape our politics. And so you're starting to hear people think about, well, maybe we've let technology go too far, right? Maybe we need to start reining it in, or we need to start rethinking our relationship to it. You're right, though, it's a hard thing to do, but I think that's where the solution is going to lie, is doing that kind of work of rethinking how we relate to technology, rethinking the role of data. And it's a very hard thing to push, especially if you're dealing with people who don't want to kind of reconsider that. And unfortunately, a lot of the administrators are not really interested in having any conversation like that, or even considering an alternative, because that's how it's done. That's what the accreditation agencies are requiring. So yeah, it's not the most hopeful kind of conclusion. And that quote where the danger is there, the saving power grows also. There's also that suggestion that it's got to get worse in order for people to be incentivized to make it better. And how much worse is it going to get is not a question that I have a good answer to.
And what is better?
Yeah. I mean, for me, I think a better model would just be one in which we realize that we get to select the model ourselves. We don't have to just do a model because that's how it's done.
But who's we?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it has to be collective, right? And so I do think it has to be us, we, all of us, who are doing this. And you're right, that's difficult to do. If
Well,
Yeah.
it's pretty ironic
Yeah.
that when you quoted Heidegger about it contains the seeds for its own transcendence, he's
Yeah.
borrowing that from Marx, and of course, that's the contradiction between labor management, and so we have to fight politically, and you can expose things like student learning outcomes for the fundamental flaws in logic and that's in there, and if you make that public, I mean, we don't know how much power we have until we try to use it. The people in East Germany didn't realize they'd be able to tear down that wall just by peacefully demonstrating.
Yeah.
And so obviously it takes political effort.
Yeah, and I think, frankly, I mean, I think probably I should mention this more, but I mean, I think that because the adjuncts are the primary laborers, I think there's got to, and I don't know how to do that, but, I think that there's a potential there because the college relies on them so much. They are the most exploited, and there's a sense in which they have a lot more power collectively than they might realize individually. Yeah, right? We all, we want a better educational environment, right? We want better educational working conditions. But again, you're exactly right. I mean, this is not sort of an easy thing, and it's not, and I think the important thing is, this also, and this is where you get into those problems with Marxism and why I think, I tend to be more of an existentialist, but, there might be this thought of, well, it's inevitable that there's going to be the revolution, right? People are eventually just going to get fed up, and then the revolution will happen, and so we just have to kind of wait for the revolution. And that doesn't work, right? It's got to be, people have to do it themselves. And we need to do it ourselves. And I think at least one way is, especially labor in the United States, I think needs to really kind of come together in a way that it hasn't in the past, and that it hasn't historically. And again, how do you do that? How do you manage that? How do you bring that about? That's a really hard question to answer.
We also need to have psychologists involved in the discussion because there is a psychological dimension to the addiction to technology.
Yeah.
And we can think of, it goes back a ways before some of you were born, but it used to be long after I was born that when people had cell phones, actually it was even before cell phones, I guess it was on computers. People had AOL, they get an email and suddenly they'd make a noise that would say, "You got mail."
Yeah.
And people would get dopamine surges because suddenly they felt important that people out there in the larger world were contacting them.
Yeah.
And now we don't do "you got mail," but people have their cell phone on their desk and they can't pay attention in class because they're constantly looking for that message that's just come in on the social media.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing. And so we need to have people think about the way we get sucked into this process and how it changes us, maybe not always for the better.
Yeah. Please.
To me, it almost seems like this is a discussion or a question of how do we manage the capitalist machine. I mean, it's such a challenging thing to face, but it's almost like the tail needs to start wagging the dog somehow. But it almost seems like it's an impossibility.
Yeah,
to stop. I mean, you can't really stop the capitalist machine, but can you manage it?
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good question. And frankly, one of the historic ways, right, that the capitalist machine has been managed is by the rise of a robust labor movement, right, which checks the worst impulses of capitalism. And unfortunately, we're in a period where labor is very weak, and
We also have the environmental movement.
Environmental movement is part of that as well, right? And I think maybe that also points to the need for a greater interaction amongst those movements and recognizing that they're often on the very same page. I mean, there are a lot of places, right, where labor maybe is in tension, like in building and trades like that, where there's a kind of a tension maybe between what laborers want in terms of work and what environmentalists want. But I think there is a real sense.
They did come together in Seattle.
Yeah.
The WTO.
Yeah. And
that was an interesting.
yeah, and our local, has especially Jim Miller, who's at City College, he's done a lot of work kind of linking the importance of the environmental issues to labor issues. And has done, I think, a lot of really good work.
Our local, KFT Local 1931, was the first union local to organize an environmental coalition with our union. And then the CFT, the California Federation of Teachers, our statewide affiliate, has an environmental caucus. And now we have an environmental caucus in the San Diego Imperial County Labor Council. So we are trying to make some of those bridges.
Yeah, because there are, in a sense, there's a lot of very similar interests. And I think you're right. I mean, it's about seeing the excesses of capitalism and trying to kind of blunt them or turn them back where possible. Yeah. Please.
Just to get back to the main body of your paper, one of the ways to think about this is that what's rational for the corporation is not necessarily rational for the individual. And the other thing, we talk in sociology about bureaucratic inertia, which is defined as the tendency of bureaucratic organizations to perpetuate themselves. And so under the guise of increasing education and teaching, the real motivation is to make themselves look good. When I first started here, I was on the academic senate, and the chancellor at the time was talking to us, and he said his first priority as chancellor was to save the taxpayers' money. And I wanted to say, if that's your first priority, you should just shut the school down. And that his first priority really ought to be educating our students. But those things get not subtly lost.
Yeah.
And it makes them look good when they get grants for things like, I call it shining path, and stuff like that. It makes them look good, but like you pointed out, it just leads to increases in deans and staff, and does nothing for students.
Yeah. Yeah, again, like just thinking about this, and again, not that the customer service model is kind of terrible model for thinking about education, but, at least the customer service model, there's this concern with the people that they're working for, where here, it's all about, right, fiscal stability, minimizing labor costs, more accountability, and there's nothing about, the people who are living in these environments that the custodial staff is cleaning, or that are working in those environments. Those people are just completely ignored from the calculations.
The duties of citizenship. We say that corporations have citizenship,
Yeah.
Yeah.
but they have no duties to the society. Apparently.
Yeah.
Well, in that case, thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's,
Thank you very much.